Welcome. I'm Carl Frederick, and I will be interviewing individuals for Kenosha Voices, an oral history project of the Kenosha County Historical Society in conjunction with Kenosha Community Media. I have worked in newspapers for more than 40 years as an editor and a reporter. 38 and a half of those years were at the Kenosha News. I am also a member of the Kenosha County Historical Society Board. We hope you enjoy these programs. I'm talking with John Collins, a former political person in our community. He served as county executive for a period of time and also as county clerk. Hello, John, how are you?
I'm wonderful this delightful afternoon.
So tell us how you come to Kenosha.
Well, our family lived up in northern Wisconsin, right on the Michigan border, and had been farmers, loggers, lumbermen, that sort of thing. And they had been there for about 50 years. They had moved from Appalachia to northern Wisconsin, as a lot of people did, for the purpose of working in the forest. When they were working, they were loggers, and they were hired by logging companies to cut trees down. And they had been doing that and then living on subsistence farms and logging for half a century. And after World War II, the factories really kicked into production in the industrial areas, particularly automobile makers, and relatives started migrating southward from the North Woods into the factories along the lakeshore here. And one of the American Motors or Nash as it was then, was one of the draws. And my uncle and his wife came to Kenosha, moved to Kenosha, and a few months later came back up to visit driving a shiny new car. And that sort of caught everybody's attention, and we started visiting down here, and then my father decided to move to Kenosha, get a job, and then send for the family, and that's what happened. We packed up our worldly goods, such as they were, and moved to the Columbus Park neighborhood in Kenosha, where I spent the next part of my life.
How old were you when you came to Kenosha?
I was about nine and a half, something like that, 1955.
And then you attended?
It's a Frank school. The neighborhood school was Frank Elementary. And that was like a 3-block walk, and that was the whole circumstance of moving into the city for a kid who'd grown up in a very small community in a small house out in the woods with no electricity and no running water. We had electricity most of the time, but no running water, that sort of thing. As that was pretty common in rural Wisconsin back at that point in time. So we moved into the city. And instead of taking a bus to school, I could walk 3 or 4 blocks and be at the schoolhouse. There were actually other kids to play with, which there weren't on the farm. And we had reliable electricity, we had running water, we had a television. It was a glorious thing.
Tell us about the neighborhood.
The Columbus Park neighborhood, Frank School neighborhood, that was a neighborhood of immigrants from Northern Europe and from the southern United States, and from the North Woods of Wisconsin and Upper Michigan. People moved here in droves to get jobs in the factories after World War II. So you had folks who came here from Italy. Lots of immigrants from Italy who had come after the Second World War, or previously. There was a surge in the early 1920s, and then there was a later surge after the Second World War. There were people who were from Germany. We had neighbors across the street who were from Germany, neighbors who were from Italy, and a lot of people who came here for factory jobs from farms. So they would have come from northern Mississippi, Tupelo, Mississippi. A whole lot of neighbors from Tupelo, Mississippi. People from western part of Tennessee, and folks from northern Wisconsin, all the anything north of Green Bay sort of thing. They immigrated to Kenosha, as well as from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. we had a group of people here in Kenosha that we called the Upers because they were from Upper Michigan, UP, Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And we would have an annual picnic. And one of the things we did is we had this big map of Wisconsin and Upper Michigan, and people would put pins in the map as where they came from. And there were clusters, and the clusters followed US Highway 41 and US Highway 45. So if you followed 45 north, or if you went over on Highway 51, you would come to Ironwood, Hurley area. We had a lot of people that immigrated down that path, and then down Highway 41 from the eastern part of the UP, and they came to Kenosha and Racine and Milwaukee and got jobs in factories and led an entirely different life than their predecessors had.
Did everyone know each other in the neighborhood? Was there
Well,
anything
those in a neighborhood like Columbus Park in the 1950s, it was a very family-oriented. I'm not going to say blissful because there were a lot of problems in the neighborhood, but everybody got along. There was camaraderie. All the kids knew everybody, all the rest of the kids, and they knew all the kids' mothers, and the mothers knew them other mothers. So you couldn't get away with too much trouble in the neighborhood because you were dealing with a community of people that all knew one another. They were all families where the dad worked at one of the factories, primarily Nash, but also a lot of people who worked at Brass. Our cousin who moved following us, and in fact lived next door to us in Kenosha. He worked at the Brass. Our next door neighbor worked at the Brass. We had all sorts of other people in the neighborhood who worked at the Brass, which was Anaconda American Brass. It was a large company in Kenosha that employed thousands of people. Randomly, other people worked at some of the other factories, McWhite and other places in Kenosha. And we had some people who were neighbors who worked for the United States Navy at Great Lakes Naval Training Station in North Chicago, Illinois. So all of these people lived in that neighborhood, and they all kind of got along. Though it wasn't a high-class neighborhood. It was a working-class, middle-class neighborhood. A significant amount of gambling and other activities in the community, which probably weren't. We don't want to write stories about, but it was part of life in the Columbus Park area at that time.
So, would you say that most of the people who came to Kenosha, either from the south or from the north, their background was in farming?
They were farmers. People. There was a migration. There's been all sorts of migrations that have taken place in the United States, and we talk about the Great Migration of African Americans from the south up to the factory jobs in Kenosha. A similar sort of things happened with the migration of people from other parts of the country, other ethnic backgrounds, who moved here to get a job in a factory where there was insurance, reliable income, and 40 hours of work a week, and it was a much more convenient life, much less work involved in living your life in an urban environment than there was in a farm where you spent your spring planting crops and making a garden. So we didn't have to do that. There was an A&P store uptown. You could walk up to the A&P store and come back with bags of groceries, and you didn't have to be out there busting your back. However, a lot of the folks, including our family, had gardens. We had a garden, and most of the Italian families in the community had gardens. And my grandmother, who had grown up in Appalachia and spent 50 years in northern Wisconsin, adapted quite nicely with the Italian neighbors who surrounded us, exchanging seeds, and we got a lot of zucchini from the neighbors in August, and my grandmother would have some sort of beans that she thought were remarkable, and she took them over there. So there was a lot of family camaraderie and troubles. It was a community.
And so as the kids grew up, they went to Bradford High School.
There was only one high school in Kenosha at that time. It was Bradford High School, and St. Joe's really, the Catholic high school, opened when I was probably about 12 or 13 years old, and we're going there anyway. But the only other option was Bradford High School, which was not a problem because Bradford High School was about 15 blocks from our house. So you walked. Every day I'd get up in the morning and walk to school, and I tell my children that, and they say, yeah, Dad, but you walk to school. It wasn't uphill, it was level. Prior to that, I had gone between Frank and Bradford. Our district was in McKinley Junior High School, which was over 2 miles, and we tried to cut that off by walking from 56th Street to 60th Street on the angle on the railroad tracks, watching out for occasional trains that came and we'd get out of the way. And so we would walk down a few blocks, catch the tracks, walk on the tracks, and then walk a dozen or so blocks along the outside of the car factory, past the place where they had their foundry, that I swear in the wintertime the snow never melted. It turned into yellow and brown sludge, and by the time we got to school we were all hacking from the smoke. But that's what we did, and it was a all-consuming process getting yourself to junior high school. High school, not a problem. We were a little older, and the walk was a little shorter, and you always saw a lot of people along the way that were going to school with you.
So as the children of farmers went to high school and graduated, what was their mindset about?
Well, I think that at the time that we graduated from high school, at least my generation, we weren't farmers anymore. That was a past life. We were now the children of factory workers, people who worked at the Motors and Nash and those kind of places. And most people that I grew up with, when you talk about them when you're a junior and seniors in high school, what are you going to do when you get through with this? Their goal was to get a good job at one of the good factories. I recall many discussions with sitting around with a bunch of guys talking about this, and what are you going to do? Well, I want to get a job at Nash because they pay well. Their downside is there were layoffs every summer, and occasionally they made some really bad cars that didn't sell, and so you're laid off for longer periods of time. But you had layoffs. Then the other option was brass. Brass was consistent, but they had strikes not infrequently, and there were some labor problems there. And the work was dirty, and there was a lot of stuff. There was a lot of cutting and fires and stuff going on. Some people didn't want to do that, but I had friends who said, that's what I want to do. I'm going to be 18 years old, and I want to go to brass, and I will work there for the rest of my life. Others who seemed a little bit more, had done their research, wanted to go to McQuaid and work at McQuaid because McQuaid had a good reputation as a solid place to work. So people who moved here from the farms quickly were no longer farm people. They were now factory workers' offspring. And most of them had the vision of continuing on in that for the rest of their lives. And my brother, who was a few years older than me, did that. He got out of high school, he got a job doing something, and then waited for an opportunity over to American Motors or over to Nash. I think it was, by the time he did that, was American Motors. And he moved into that environment, got a job there, and worked there for 40 years until he was ready to retire. Retired with a very nice pension, very nice insurance package, and he had made for himself and his family a very good life.
And for you, graduating from high school?
I didn't want to work in the factory. Now there's some discussion in the family about why I didn't want to work in the family. Some people may have alluded to the fact that I was lazy. I didn't want to do that kind of work. I just thought it was just because I had a different calling, that I couldn't envision myself out, standing next to a machine all day. It's not the way my mind functioned. So I was kind of an offshoot of the family, sort of like, oh, he's the odd guy. But I wanted to do something else. I really didn't know what I wanted to do. And there's a period of time when you're growing up when you're 17, 18, 19, maybe 25, for some people 46, but there's a period of time when you're really trying to find out where you fit into the universe. And my kids did this, I did that, and I think most people have. They kind of take a shot at doing this, and I want to move sideways and find something else. And for me, I went to what was then Kenosha Technical Institute, KTI, where City Hall is on 52nd Street. That was they offered a program in an area called data processing, now called IT. And I couldn't do the math, and I was lost. And then finally we took a field trip to look at an actual IT shop or a data processing shop, and I went in there and I came out screaming, not literally, but inside, this is not what I want to do. And this wasn't working for me at all, and I was losing confidence in myself. And I ran into a friend who went to a little tiny college in Lake Geneva, in Union Grove, Wisconsin, called Racine Kenosha County Teachers College. It was a very tiny school. Went there and fit in, and my life was turned around and saved because I built confidence and was able to succeed and do all of that. Made a whole raft of really good friends and fit into that environment nicely. And then from there, after completing 2 years there was a group of us all transferred up to University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh, where we completed our degrees, and all of us went back to teach. And I ended up teaching at Wilson School, inner city school in Kenosha, where I spent 10 years of basically my late 20s into my late 30s.
Okay. What did you teach?
I taught everything. When you're sixth grade, you teach all subjects. Though I did not teach music because I would have driven the children out of the classroom if I tried. So I didn't. I taught math, reading, social studies, and I had a specialty area was science and social studies. Did that for 10 years and enjoyed it, loved it. It was though I loved it less in the ninth year than I did at the second year. You know, it's burnout. It's just getting, again, you're in a situation where you're really enjoying what you're doing and you're good at it. And I got an award for being the teacher of the year, and it was all exciting, good stuff. But then you're in the same classroom you were in 5 years ago, and you're teaching the little brothers of the children that you taught before, and you're using the same books, and I just got bored with it.
Did you ever have occasion to have problems with administration that you would have to go to a union for, or?
Well, I was heavily involved in the first the Kenosha Teachers Union and later the Kenosha Education Association, and it was a difficult relationship between those two groups and the administration. And part of the process, because it's a large institutional sort of thing, it's very driven by policy and rules and constraining. A lot of teachers burn out because they're constrained as to what they can do and how they can teach. It's a noble calling. My wife taught for 39 years, and I enjoyed it. It's a great thing. My son-in-law is a school teacher, and I recommend it to anyone. It's a noble thing to do.
So at the time of you leaving teaching, what did you plan on doing?
Well, I left when I was active. I was a teacher. I was active in the union. I was active in politics because I had a passion for politics, and was chairman of the local Kenosha County Democratic Party. I was involved in statewide political things, and I was very active as the volunteer job. And in 1978, the county clerk left to run for the legislature and called me and said, "Hey, you're you are running for county clerk. And my response was, I don't know what the hell the county clerk does. And was informed that that didn't make a lot of difference. I could find that out pretty quickly. So I did, and I ran and I won that election and served for 7 years. I would have been elected 4 times, and then left in the middle of the last term for a different office.
Okay. Do you have any stories from your time as a teacher or working
Well,
in
you
the
know,
union?
the union stuff was interesting because you had the Kenosha Teachers Union, which was affiliated with the AFL-CIO, was more of a traditional union. Then there was the Kenosha Education Association, which was not affiliated, and they went back and forth as to who was going to perform the job of representing the teachers at the bargaining table, and they had made an arrangement where they had a co-equal representation. And then the Kenosha Education Association had a referendum with all the teachers and won, so that they were the sole bargaining representative for all the teachers. So they did all the bargaining for all the contracts, and that created a whole political schism in the community here among labor people, but eventually it worked out. I enjoyed the kids a lot. I did a lot of really fun things with the kids. We ran programs where we took inner city children who had, honest to God, kids in Kenosha who had never seen Lake Michigan. You know, they just had absolutely no experiences, and we took them to a summer camp. There was like 8 teachers, I think, and another equal cohort of aides, and we took 100 inner city children to a summer camp in northern Wisconsin for a week each summer. That was really filled your soul with a lot of fun, because these kids, so for some of them, that was the only time they'd ever been anywhere other than around the block in the community they lived in. These were very poor kids living on public assistance, with some of them with unfortunate parental situations, and we were able to help them out and give them some exposure to the rest of the world.
Okay, so you, after entering the political scene, so to
Yes.
speak, and you were county clerk, you then, after 7 years,
I ascended to
You
a higher
ascended
job.
to-
To a higher job. I had been the county clerk, and there was in early 1982, I think, the county board decided that they wanted to have an elected county executive who would be responsible for the management of the entirety of the county government while they did the policy setting and budgeting and that sort of thing. The classic administrative legislative sort of arrangement. There was the first election was in 1982. Gilbert Dozmagan ran and was elected county executive, and had the unfortunate situation of having to be the first one and do a lot of the battles, and in terms of creating an administration, and ended up being not very popular in the community as a result of a lot of those wars that went on. I ran in 1986 and unseated him, and I then stayed there for 12 years, 3 terms, 3 4-year terms as county executive, until fate happened in 1998, and I lost the election. And then I went on to other parts of my life.
so you were elected in 1986
Yep.
to county executive.
Yep, 90 and 94.
And what did you face becoming county executive?
Well, there was no structure in the administration. There was a lot of things. You know, when you run for office, you have planned things that you want to do, and then you have unplanned things like tidal waves that hit you on the side and cause you to have to do other things. So the planned things was reorganizing and restructuring the inside of the government, which had never been completed and did not bear any sort of resemblance to how you would have a management organization in a structure. You know, it was just not well put together. So that was my goal, and economic development was my goal. Those were the 2 stated goals, and we were having the same problem in economic development in the community with competing groups, each trying to keep the other one from getting the brass ring, and as a result, nothing was being successful, so we needed to get that restructured. So that was what I set out to do. And then shortly thereafter, we had a situation with Chrysler and American Motors. American Motors had for a very long time it lacked the financial resources of a large corporation. There were the big three automakers and then little American Motors. American Motors did not have the necessary structure to compete in the automobile market. They didn't have the finances, they didn't have the administration to produce a wide enough variety of cars. They only had like 2 assembly lines, so they could make only a couple of varieties of cars, and Chrysler could produce huge cars and little cars. They could produce expensive cars and cheap cars, so as the economy changed, they could adjust what they were selling to the public. And if you went into a Chrysler dealership, they had a whole plethora of vehicles that you could buy. If you went into an American Motors dealership, there was this one or that one. There weren't a lot of other cars. They had then acquired Jeep, which gave them a little bit more variety in the marketplace, but they didn't have enough. So they had done a partnership with a automobile company out of France. That company came in and they were trying to figure out how to merge, and then Chrysler wanted the Jeep brand, so Chrysler stepped in and took over the company, and now we had to deal with this situation with a larger manufacturer moving into the community and taking over the operation of the automobile manufacturer that had been here for 100 years. And it didn't go well because there were situations where Chrysler needed production of some cars, and we had the facility to make it, but those were short-term commitments on the part of Chrysler. They weren't going to be here for a very long time. They got in, by 87, 88, they got into a situation where they were closing the plant. They were basically closing everything down except the engine production. And I had to deal with that as in the community. It was a very, very difficult thing to do. We had 5,000 jobs. At one point, we had 7,000 jobs at that factory. Chrysler came along and said, we're going to negotiate with you, and the negotiations didn't go that well.
Negotiations between the two companies? Or the Kenosha?
To clarify, Chrysler had taken the business over. It was now Chrysler. Chrysler and American Motors had this engagement period before they got married. And during the engagement period, American Motors was making some cars for Chrysler. And then after the marriage, they weren't making any American Motors cars there. They were just making Chrysler cars in that factory. And Chrysler came to see us to negotiate the movement of those, the manufacture of those Chrysler cars in Kenosha. They came to us and said, here's a list of demands, and if you don't meet these demands, we're not going to make those cars here anymore. We will make them in Detroit. And we eventually got to the point where we gave them money and all sorts of benefits to have them come here. They came here, but they didn't stay very long because they needed to get another factory in Michigan open, and they just closed the factory here.
Did they make any promises when they
initially?
Yes.
Well, okay. There was a particular car. It was they had a K car, then they had these little cars. There were Omni Horizons, and those Dodge Omni, one was a Horizon, one was a
Plymouth.
So they were going to make these two cars here. They promised us that they would make them here in exchange for the money that we were offering them. And the representative of Chrysler came to talk to me in my office and said, and told us that unless we committed to paying them basically $500,000 to resurface a parking lot, that they would take all of their manufacturing to Detroit. And we eventually did that. Went to the county board for approval, and one of their representatives got up in front of the county board and promised that they would continue manufacturing those vehicles here until they stopped making them altogether. And then they changed their mind, and they had lied to us. They had just told us a lie. We ended up in a confrontation. Governor Thompson, our congressman here, Les Aspin, had meetings in Washington with Lee Iacocca, the president of Chrysler. They confronted him with the tape that we had of that promise. He got quite angry. We ended up going through a whole season, almost a year of negotiations between the county, the city, the state of Wisconsin, and Chrysler. And it was really a very ugly and very stressful time. Probably the most interesting event was when the United Auto Workers decided that they were going to have a mass protest about the plant closing. So they made an arrangement to have a big rally in the middle of 52nd Street in Kenosha, underneath the car overpass that said American Motors, Chrysler, and they set up a stage in the middle of the street, closed the street off, and they invited civil rights activist Jesse Jackson to come speak. And I was on the stage, the mayor, and the whole litany of people, and thousands of people in the middle of the street for this protest. And the incumbent mayor, Gene Dorff, got up and made some inappropriate comments and embarrassed the community and himself and everyone else. And it didn't do any good. I mean, that was broadcast live nationwide on CNN. And it didn't cause Chrysler to change its mind. Eventually, we reached a settlement with Chrysler where they gave us checks for economic development, for some community organizations, and eventually set up a scholarship fund. But they left. And then
how did they make this deal with the money they're going to provide? How did you know that, okay, we're closing? And what had to be done at that time?
Well, it became self-evident that they were closing. They announced that they were closing the factory. So we are closing automobile production. They were going to retain the engine line, which had 1,000 employees making Chrysler engines. So they had that leverage in the negotiations process. So if we pushed too hard, they were going to close that too. So there was a delicate space for negotiations, and it really just, the thing dragged on. It was just this thing happened in the spring, and then it went on, and it slowly just sort of faded away without any conclusion. And I had a meeting with the governor in probably September of that year and said, we have to get this thing done. It's laying there, and nothing is happening, and they're closing the plant, and where are we going to go with this? And so we concluded the negotiations and got our checks, and they closed the plant. The most significant thing I think of those negotiations was, for me, though I like to say that, and it was true, because when I got the initial call from the Chrysler Corporation, they said, "What do you need here?" And I said, "Number one, I want those buildings gone. I don't want blocks and blocks and blocks full of empty factory buildings that everybody in town is going to presume that it's going to reopen. They'll all sit there and say, something's going to come here, and nothing ever will. It's just tear the factories down. And Chrysler agreed to that on the phone, and they kept their word on that, and it cost them about $80 million to take those buildings down. But they're down. And now their city is in the process of redeveloping that property for some other purpose. Much better situation than having 40-year vacant buildings with rats in them in the middle of the city, I think.
Okay. So the Jeep factory stayed open, or the engine factory, which I think they made Jeep engines.
They made engines for Jeeps and other things. Okay. They stayed open until 2010. So they ended up with essentially a 20-year opportunity to stay open. They stayed open for 20 years after they stopped manufacturing cars. So they had employees here. They had at one point well over 1,000 employees here making engines. At the conclusion of that time, it was down to a few hundred. Because it just slowed down because they consolidated their engine manufacturing in Delaware and in Canada. And this factory here, they just didn't need it, and they slowly just closed a little piece at a time until it was all gone.
So at the time, you had no experience in dealing with something like this.
I had absolutely zero experience in negotiating the closing of the largest factory in the state of Wisconsin. I hope that none of my successors have that opportunity. But the significance of all of that, besides all of that stuff, the real significance of that is what that factory was to Kenosha, and it left. That factory was emblematic of Kenosha. If you went anywhere in the Midwest and they said, where are you from? And you said, I'm from Kenosha, Wisconsin. They said, that's where you make cars. We had a car factory here that employed at one point 13,000 people making Nash cars and later American Motors cars. It was huge. The fate of that factory determined the fate of this community. We either thrived or starved, and I saw both of those things happen. I saw people moving into Kenosha in the hordes to get jobs at American Motors. I stood outside of American Motors on 52nd Street handing out political brochures, and you would see carloads full of people with Illinois license plates. Mom with 8 guys in the car would pull up. They'd all get out of the car, go into the factory, and she would take off and go back home. She was running a shuttle service. There were people from Milwaukee, from Racine, who commuted here to work. We imported workers from all over the world, principally from the region here, to come in and work at that factory. It made the identity of Kenosha. It made us who we were. When they had a bad year, which was not uncommon, I remember my dad being laid off for 2 years and had to go find jobs that nobody else would take to feed the family because he wasn't going to take any sort of assistance. So he had all sorts of little odd jobs just to feed the family. And then you get called back, and then all of a sudden you're working double shifts, and you're working Saturdays, and you're working Sundays. And in 1963, they made more cars than any factory in the United States made. They were like, this was a big deal, and it went away. And the next generations that come along and move into Kenosha drive down 52nd Street, and they see this big field with grass growing in it. And they say, what is that, a park? That was the heart of the economy of Kenosha. Significantly, a major employer in southeastern Wisconsin and northeastern Illinois, with people coming in to work there and going out every night. Since that has happened, since they left, we are now a net exporter of workers. people get in their cars and they go somewhere else and they work and they come back. We have lost that position we had, and it has had a very detrimental effect on the economy of Kenosha. Some would disagree with that, because if you were running a ma and pa car repair shop and you were looking for workers and the Motors was hiring, you couldn't find anybody. So if the Motors was laying off, people would come and knock on your door and say, could I please get a job here? But then 6 months later they get called back, and guess what? The workers went away. You trained them and all that stuff, they went away. So, but it left. It left in the late 1980s, and the hardest part of what I did wasn't negotiating all of the stuff. It was convincing the community that they weren't ever coming back, and we had to find a new place to look for economic development, other than in big factories, because the big factories were going away. They were never going to return, and it's really, really hard to tell people that, to look them in the eye and say, those big factories that used to be here, call their name. We had McWhite, we had Eaton, we had the Brass, we had American Motors, we had Simmons, we had Jockey. They're all gone. And guess what, folks? They're not coming back. And that is a very hard message to give to the community, where everybody in that community had fed their families off of one of those factories for the last 50 years.
And this is just 2 years into a 4-year term.
Yep, it was interesting. It was an interesting time to be alive.
So then you were able to go back into modernization
Well,
of
we-
the
you know, we-
administration and
we did.
computers.
Yeah, well, we did. We did. Yeah, we did this. We rebuilt the inside of the county administration at the same time. It was, sometimes you have to balance more than one thing at a time, and so we were doing both of those at the same time. We were rebuilding the internal administration of the county government, developing new electronic devices that did the work of old-time adding machines. So we did that. That mission was accomplished at the same time that we were doing the dealing with the Chrysler and the loss. It wasn't just Chrysler. Chrysler was the big one. It was the other factories that just were going away one at a time, and changed the nature of the community. We are much more a bedroom community now. Most of the businesses that have moved in here have been logistics companies, warehousing, where the number of jobs per 1,000 square feet is remarkably different than it was a generation ago.
Any interesting stories from trying to modernize county government or any other issues that?
Well, going from a point when backroom people are using 1948 Monroe calculators to the point when it's all being done by Microsoft programmed hardware, it was a challenge, because the challenge is cultural more than it is technological, because people who have been doing the same thing the same way for 30 years, and now you're telling them you can't do that anymore. Take the pencil, put it in the drawer, you're not using that. It is really difficult. But we did it. And I was surprised. I had one of my staff people, who was one of the senior people in county government at the time, nice lady, and I thought, this is not going to work. And she learned how to use the computer faster than I did, for sure. But a lot of them had troubles with that, and plus we didn't have the personnel infrastructure, the inside the system to be able to do this. So we didn't have anybody who knew how to run a computer. And our auditors came in there and said, "Oh my God, you've got to automate," which was true. And I was glad someone besides me was saying that. And now the auditors came in there and slammed their report down on the county supervisor's desk. So you have to do this. All right. So how do we do this? Who do we have in the room that knows how to do this? There's nobody. So we ended up spending way too much money on consultants, some of whom weren't as good as others. So it was an expensive transition because of missteps and misunderstandings and lack of expertise. By the time we ended this, my term, we had a very nice IT department that was reliable and that was trustworthy, and I could pick up the phone and say, what do we need here? And I knew that I was getting reliable information. At one point, we bought some big box computers, mini computers they used to call them, and the auditor came in and said, why did you buy those? I said, well, the IT person told us that's what we needed. He said, you know what you're going to use those for next year? No, he said, you're going to use those to put potted plants on because they're going to be obsolete in 2 years. I don't know. So that's the process you go through from a 1948 Monroe calculator to systems that are integrated and have a high capacity. You're going to make missteps along the way. You're going to spend a lot of money on bringing in outside expertise, but it got to where it needed to be.
Any other issues in your second or third
Well, we
term?
had the nursing home. All of this happened. We had 1988, 89 was an interesting period in my life at work and at home. Lots of stuff going on at the same time. And we had a nursing home, Brookside Care Center. It was antiquated. Staff was antiquated. The staff organization, I don't mean the individuals, the organization was antiquated. And the building was antiquated. And we'd been limping along and having all sorts of management issues. And we ended up bringing in somebody from outside to help us. And eventually got to the point when we were able to stabilize it, and after stabilizing it, to build a brand new building. I'm very proud of that. A brand new building, one floor, and it's still there, and it's been there since about 1990, and it always gets awards as one of the best nursing homes in the state. County run, well managed, and I'm very, very pleased with that. Very pleased with that. And it was, to prove its success, a couple of years ago, they expanded it. Better than having something torn down that you built, right?
So, any other issues pop up while you're
every day, and those kind of jobs, every day is, you have a schedule, you've got your calendar, and you show up at work, and waves come in that you did unexpected, some of them small, some of them large. You just have to be nimble enough to be able to resolve those, but you also have to be reliant on a very qualified, trustworthy staff, because you can't run things in terms of managing things. I've seen a lot of fools who try to micromanage organizations, and you can't do it. They end up, somebody decides they're going to get under the hood and fix it. They open the hood, and while they're underneath with a wrench, somebody in the back took everything out of the truck and went away with it. You need to be able to have reliable people who you trust implicitly, and who understand that if they violate that trust, they're going to be gone in a half hour. So if you run that, and if you run it with competent staff, and you let them have their head and do their job and support them, it'll generally work out pretty well. And I was very pleased with our administration.
So you served 3 terms as county executive. Did you seek a fourth?
Oh, I lost.
You lost. What were the circumstances that
lost
made?
You can only tick off so many people over a period of time, and I ticked off a lot of people because I had to, from my view, I wouldn't have it any other way. I made tough decisions, and sometimes tough decisions are not politically smart. I also understood I was taking a risk when I made those decisions, but I made some tough decisions, and most of those revolved around trying to get a jail built, but that got built too.
Okay, so you had upset people along the way.
Apple carts, yeah.
And so in this last term, were there any significant issues that angered even more people that might have?
Well, it was we had a big fight with the hospitals over their cost, and we ran a big ad in the Wall Street Journal saying, "Come into Kenosha and help us. Our hospital costs are too high." That ended up not making the hospital administrators happy, and we had a massive fight over that. I was right, but you know, sometimes you lose. Being right isn't enough to win the battle. So I was right and lost the battle. The hospitals got their vengeance at the election. You know?
Is there another issue?
Well, we had the jail too. The jail issue was resolved. The jail issue got resolved. So this is what happened. We had an fight about where are you going to put a jail. We'd never ever build a building that you can't expand. So around 1980, the county built this jail building, Kenosha County, it's public safety building. And it was built, they had an architect I wouldn't hire again, who ended up suing, and there was all sorts of stuff going on. But the building was, you know, cement on 4 sides and roads on 4 sides. So what happens when you get more prisoners? There's no place to put them. So we ended up with people piled all over the place, and the state coming in and wagging their finger, and they're going to go at us because of that. So we had to put a new jail up. Well, this went round and round. So we can't do it there. We can't do it next door because then you got to build 8 stories or something, and it's extremely inefficient. So Collins went around looking for a site for jail, and everywhere he put a sign up saying, "I want to put the jail here," there was a ruckus. Everybody got mad. Neighbors would be just really ticked off, and we went from blocked. It was terrible. It was a terrible, terrible thing. But we ended up with finally finding a site that nobody objected to. I thought jails. People don't want a jail next to them. They don't want a dump next to them. There's a whole list of things people don't want next to them. They don't want it in their neighborhood. They want it in somebody else's neighborhood. So take this whole big thing you're going to build and put it over by my cousin's house because I don't like him anyway, but don't put it here. So obviously it has to go somewhere. So we found a spot where the jail, we put a jail there, and it's still there, and they've expanded that too, unfortunately. So we've got this big jail out on Highway H in Kenosha by the airport, and it's now 25 years old, and it's functioning well, and life's good, and the prisoners are being fed, and it works. So we got that done. So we had the fight going on between the jail and the hospitals at the same time. So it got so it ended up with something perhaps more than coincidence, where the ex-sheriff was hired by the hospital. The ex-sheriff had been unhappy with me over this jail issue. We'd come to had a verbal discourse over that. So the hospital ended up hiring him, and then he ran against me and beat me by a handful of votes.
So looking back at it all now,
you know what? I always want to be able to look back and say I did what I thought was the right thing to do. That's a good thing, I think. I did what was the right thing. It was not the politically correct, the politically opportune thing to do, and it cost me an election. But guess what? I walked away with my head held high and moved on, and have been involved in the Kenosha community and for 20-some years after that, and I'm still here.
Thanks for being here, John.
All right.